The rain hammered against the windows of the operations room at Pearl Harbor as Commander David Chen stared at the intelligence report that arrived by courier 30 minutes earlier. It was 0400 hours on November 3rd, 1944, and what he was reading made no sense according to everything he understood about naval warfare. Chen had been analyzing Japanese naval movements for 18 months, ever since his transfer from destroyer duty to Pacific Fleet intelligence. He had studied every major engagement from Coral Sea to Lake Gulf. He understood Japanese tactical doctrine, their communication patterns, their operational preferences. He knew how they thought, how they reacted, how they made decisions under pressure. And what this intelligence report was suggesting contradicted all of that knowledge. The report came from signals intelligence intercepts, decoded messages from Japanese naval headquarters, discussing something the translators were calling the dispersal phenomenon. Japanese radar stations across the Western Pacific had been tracking what appeared to be routine American destroyer movements for the past week. Individual ships, small groups, nothing that suggested coordinated operations. But when intelligence analysts had plotted all the reported positions on a single chart, a pattern emerged that was either coincidence or something far more significant. Chen walked to the large plotting table that dominated the center of the operations room. The table showed the entire Pacific theater, from the west coast of the United States to the Philippines, marked with colored pins indicating known positions of American and Japanese forces. He began placing new pins based on the Japanese sighting reports, each one representing an American destroyer or small group detected by Japanese reconnaissance. One destroyer reported 400 miles northeast of the Marshalls, heading southwest at 12 knots. Two destroyers spotted 600 miles east of the Marianas, proceeding independently on parallel courses. A single destroyer observed near Wake Island, apparently conducting anti-submarine patrols. 3 destroyers detected south of the Hawaiian chain, steaming in loose formation toward the southwest. The reports continued. Scattered contacts across thousands of square miles of ocean, each one appearing routine and unremarkable. But when Chen stepped back and looked at the complete picture, he saw something that made his pulse quicken. The scattered contacts, if projected forward along their reported courses and speeds, would converge. Not immediately, not obviously, but in approximately 5 to 6 days. All of these apparently independent destroyer movements would bring the vessels to roughly the same area of the Western Pacific, approximately 800 miles east of the Philippines. Chen checked his calculations 3 times, certain he must be making an error. The convergence was too precise to be coincidental. The timing was too exact. The courses were too carefully calculated. If what he was seeing was real, then American forces were executing a dispersed approach operation of unprecedented scale and complexity. Dozens of destroyers, possibly more than 100, were navigating independently across vast ocean distances toward a common objective, maintaining the appearance of routine operations while actually conducting a coordinated maneuver. The implications were staggering. Conventional naval doctrine held that large forces needed to operate as concentrated units for mutual protection and coordinated action. Radio communication was considered essential for maintaining formation and responding to changing circumstances. The idea that dozens or hundreds of ships might navigate independently for days, maintaining radio silence, then converge with precision on a target, it was operationally radical. Chen picked up the secure telephone and called Captain William Downs, the senior intelligence officer for Pacific Fleet. Downs answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the early hour. Chen explained what he had discovered, describing the pattern of Japanese sighting reports and the projected convergence. "How confident are you in this analysis?" Downs asked after a long silence. "The mathematics are solid, sir. If these destroyers maintain their reported courses and speeds, they converge in the Western Pacific in 5 to 6 days. The probability of this being coincidental is essentially 0. Someone planned this. And the Japanese. Do they see what you're seeing? Chen hesitated. The intelligence intercept suggests they're tracking individual contacts, but not recognizing the overall pattern. They're seeing trees, not the forest. Their doctrine assumes large American forces will operate as concentrated units, so they're not looking for dispersed coordination. Get Admiral Nimitz on the line, Downs said. He needs to see this immediately. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at the operations room 40 minutes later, accompanied by Admiral Raymond Spruance and several senior staff officers. Nimitz had commanded Pacific Fleet since the dark days after Pearl Harbor, and he had learned to trust his intelligence officers' assessments, even when they challenged conventional thinking. He listened as Chen presented his analysis, studying the plotting table with the concentration of a man who understood that wars were won or lost based on the quality of such assessments. You're suggesting that someone, presumably one of our carrier task force commanders, has independently developed and is executing a dispersed approach operation involving potentially over 100 destroyers. Nimitz said slowly, without informing fleet headquarters, without requesting authorization, simply implementing it as an operational innovation. Yes, sir. That's what the evidence suggests. Nimitz turned to Spruance. Who would do this? Who has the authority, the resources, and frankly the audacity to attempt something like this without clearing it through proper channels? Spruance studied the plotting table for a long moment before responding. Halsey is operating near the Philippines with Third Fleet. He has the destroyers, and he's certainly capable of operational innovation. But this level of coordination would require extensive planning, precise navigation, meticulous timing. That's not Halsey's style. He's aggressive and bold, but this operation requires patience and precision. Mitcher, Nimitz said quietly. Mark Mitcher. Spruance nodded slowly. It would fit his profile. He's been experimenting with dispersed carrier operations for months. He understands the limitations of Japanese radar and reconnaissance, and he has the tactical sophistication to plan something this complex. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58th, the fast carrier task force that had been the spearhead of American advances across the Pacific. At 57, Mitcher was older than many of the admirals he served under, a quiet, weathered man whose unassuming demeanor concealed one of the most innovative tactical minds in the Navy. He had pioneered carrier strike tactics, developed new approaches to air defense, and consistently found ways to achieve operational objectives that conventional doctrine said were impossible. Nimitz walked to the communications station. Get me Admiral Mitcher. Secure channel. Priority override. The connection took 15 minutes to establish, routed through multiple relay stations to reach Mitcher's flagship somewhere in the Western Pacific. When Mitcher's voice finally came through, calm and unhurried despite the early hour, Nimitz spoke without preamble. Mark, this is Chester. I'm looking at a plotting table that suggests you're conducting a dispersed approach operation with approximately 100 destroyers, converging on positions east of the Philippines. Is my intelligence correct? There was a pause, the silence filled with the crackle of static on the long-distance connection. Then, Mitcher's voice came through, still calm, almost matter of fact. Yes, sir. That's correct. Without informing fleet headquarters. Without requesting authorization. Sir, I submitted a proposal for this type of operation 6 weeks ago. It was under review. The operational opportunity presented itself, and I made the decision to execute. I take full responsibility. Nimitz closed his eyes briefly, a gesture his staff recognized as indicating he was making a decision that would have significant consequences. Mark, you're conducting an operation that violates every principle of concentration of force that we've been teaching at the War College for 50 years. You've scattered over 100 destroyers across thousands of miles of ocean, maintaining radio silence, navigating independently. If this fails, if ships get lost, if Japanese forces catch your destroyers scattered and unable to support each other, the casualties will be catastrophic. and it will be on you. Yes, sir. I understand. But if it succeeds, if you pull this off, you'll have demonstrated that everything we thought we knew about naval operations needs to be reconsidered. You'll have changed warfare. Yes, sir. Nimitz opened his eyes and looked at the officers gathered around the plotting table. Continue the operation. But I want detailed reports every 6 hours. I want to know position status, any problems. And Mark, when this is over, whether it succeeds or fails, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about the chain of command and operational authorization. Understood, sir. Thank you, sir. The connection ended. Nimitz turned to his staff. Gentlemen, we are now observers of an operational experiment that will either revolutionize naval warfare or end several careers, possibly including mine. Commander Chen, I want continuous tracking of this operation. Plot every destroyer position we can confirm. Calculate convergence timing. Identify potential problems. If this operation is going to fail, I want to know before it happens so we can attempt damage control. Yes, sir. And get me everything we have on dispersed naval operations. Historical precedents, theoretical studies, anything. If Mitcher is rewriting the book on naval warfare, I want to understand what book he's writing. The historical research revealed that dispersed approach operations were not entirely unprecedented. During the Age of Sail, fleets had routinely operated scattered across vast ocean areas, converging for battle using pre-arranged rendezvous points and celestial navigation. Admiral Nelson had famously kept his fleet dispersed, while searching for the French fleet before Trafalgar, concentrating only when battle was imminent. But those operations had involved dozens of ships at most, not hundreds. And they had occurred in an era when communication was impossible anyway, making dispersal the only practical option for covering large areas. What Mitcher was attempting was different in scale and complexity. Modern destroyers traveled at speeds 3 times faster than sailing ships. They operated in an environment where radar and radio communication were available, making concentration theoretically easier. The decision to deliberately disperse, to voluntarily give up the advantages of radio communication and mutual support, that was radical. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reeves, a naval theorist assigned to Pacific Fleet Planning Staff, spent the next 48 hours analyzing the operational principles underlying Mitcher's approach. She presented her findings to Admiral Nimitz on November 5th, standing before the plotting table where the positions of Mitcher's destroyers were now being updated every 6 hours based on Japanese sighting reports and occasional position updates transmitted by American submarines. Admiral, what Mitcher is doing represents a fundamental shift in how we think about naval operations, Reeves began. Traditional doctrine emphasizes concentration because it provides mutual support, coordinated firepower, and simplified command and control. But concentration also creates vulnerabilities. A concentrated fleet is easy to detect, easy to track, easy to target. Mitcher is exploiting the fact that dispersed forces, if properly coordinated, can achieve surprise and operational flexibility that concentrated forces cannot. She pointed to the plotting table. Look at what the Japanese are seeing. Individual destroyers, small groups, all apparently conducting routine operations. Nothing that suggests a major offensive is being prepared. Their radar stations are tracking these contacts, but because the contacts are dispersed and moving independently, Japanese intelligence isn't recognizing them as elements of a coordinated force. They're seeing exactly what we want them to see, routine patrol activity. But the coordination challenge. Spruance interjected. How do you coordinate the movements of over 100 ships without radio communication? How do you ensure they arrive at the right place at the right time? Pre-planned navigation, Reeves replied. Each destroyer captain has detailed orders specifying exact courses, speeds, and timing. They navigate using celestial fixes and dead reckoning. As long as each captain executes his orders precisely, the ships will converge as planned. It's the same principle that allowed Nelson to concentrate his fleet before Trafalgar, just applied at much larger scale with modern navigation tools. And if something goes wrong? Nimitz asked. If weather scatters the formation, if navigation errors accumulate, if mechanical problems delay some ships, then the operation fails. That's the risk Mitscher is accepting. He's betting that superior training, meticulous planning, and precise execution can overcome the coordination challenges. If he's right, we gain a capability that changes how we fight this war. If he's wrong, we lose ships and men. The tension in the operations room grew as November 6th progressed into November 7th. The Japanese sighting reports continued, tracking individual American destroyers as they moved across the Western Pacific. But the reports also showed something new. The scattered contacts were gradually moving closer together. The convergence that Commander Chen had predicted was beginning to occur. At Pearl Harbor, intelligence officers plotted each new sighting, watching as the pattern became clearer. Destroyers that had been separated by hundreds of miles were now within 50 to 100 miles of each other. The independent movements were coalescing into something that would soon be recognizable as a concentrated force. The question was whether the Japanese would recognize what was happening before Mitscher was ready to strike. The answer came on November 8th, when Japanese naval headquarters transmitted an urgent message to all commands in the Western Pacific. American signals intelligence intercepted and decoded the message within hours. Commander Chen read it with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal dread. Large American naval formation detected east of Philippines. The message read, composition uncertain. Estimated strength 50 to 100 vessels, possibly more. Formation appears to be concentrating from dispersed approach. All commands prepare for major offensive operations. Combined fleet to sortie immediately. They've figured it out, Chen said quietly, handing the decoded message to Captain Downes. They've recognized the pattern. They know something major is coming. Downes read the message and immediately called Admiral Nimitz. Within minutes, the senior staff was gathered around the plotting table, once again, studying the latest intelligence. The Japanese have recognized that our scattered contacts are actually elements of a coordinated force, Downes explained. They're ordering their fleet to sortie, preparing to engage what they believe is a major American offensive. Which is exactly what Mitscher wanted, Spruance said slowly. He's drawn the Japanese fleet out of its anchorages, forced them to commit to action based on incomplete intelligence. Now the question is whether his destroyers can execute their mission before Japanese forces can intercept them. Nimitz studied the plotting table in silence. The positions of Mitscher's destroyers showed they were approximately 12 hours from their strike positions off the Philippine coast. Japanese naval forces, sortying from anchorages around Manila Bay and other ports, would need at least 18 to 24 hours to reach intercept positions. The timing was close, uncomfortably close, but it appeared Mitscher would reach his objectives first. Send to Mitscher, Nimitz said. Japanese forces sorting to intercept. Execute strike operations at earliest opportunity, then withdraw at maximum speed. Do not, repeat do not, attempt to engage Japanese surface forces with destroyers alone. The message was transmitted through multiple channels to ensure Mitscher received it. The response came back within 30 minutes, terse and confident. Understood. Commencing strike operation 0600 local time November 9th. Will complete mission and withdraw before Japanese forces can intercept. November 9th, 1944, dawned clear and calm across the Philippine Sea. Aboard USS Kidd, Commander James Lawrence stood on the bridge wing, watching the horizon as his destroyer steamed west at 25 knots. Around him, spread across 50 miles of ocean, over 100 American destroyers were converging on their strike positions. After 8 days of independent navigation, maintaining radio silence, trusting mathematics and celestial fixes to bring them to this moment, the scattered fleet was finally coming together. Lawrence had commanded destroyers since 1942, fighting in battles from the Solomons to the Marianas. He understood his ship, knew her capabilities and limitations, trusted his crew. But this operation had tested him in ways that combat never had. Combat was immediate, reactive, instinctive. This operation had required patience, precision, faith in planning. For 8 days, he had navigated across thousands of miles of ocean, seeing no other American ships, receiving no communications, trusting that dozens of other captains were doing exactly the same thing, all of them moving toward the same objective. Now, as dawn broke, he could see other destroyers on the horizon. USS Hazelwood to the north, USS Heermann to the south, USS Hull ahead, USS Johnston behind. The scattered fleet was concentrating, transforming from independent vessels into a coordinated strike force. The sight filled Lawrence with profound relief and professional pride. They had done it. They had executed an operation that conventional wisdom said was impossible. "Captain, radio traffic," his communications officer reported. "Admiral Mitcher is broadcasting strike orders." Lawrence took the message form and read quickly. His destroyer division was assigned to strike Japanese installations at Subic Bay, focusing on fuel storage facilities and ammunition depots. Time on target Zoo 700 hours. Duration of bombardment 30 minutes. Withdrawal course 090 degrees true, speed 27 knots. "Al ahead flank," Lawrence ordered. "Sound general quarters. Load all guns with high explosive. We're going to war, gentlemen." The bombardment began precisely at 0700 hours, as over 100 American destroyers opened fire simultaneously on targets along the Philippine coast. The coordination was remarkable, the result of meticulous planning and precise execution. Each destroyer division had specific targets, specific timing, specific withdrawal routes. The entire operation was choreographed like a ballet, except this ballet involved thousands of tons of high explosive shells. USS Keat approached Subic Bay at high speed, her 5-inch guns trained on the fuel storage tanks that intelligence had identified as critical to Japanese naval operations. Lawrence stood on the bridge, watching through binoculars as his ship's first salvo landed among the storage tanks. Massive fireballs erupted as fuel ignited, black smoke boiling into the morning sky. "Shift fire to the ammunition depot," Lawrence ordered. 3 salvos, then we're getting out of here." The ammunition depot exploded with a force that rattled Kidd's hull, even at 8,000 yards distance. Secondary explosions continued for several minutes as stored munitions cooked off. Lawrence watched with grim satisfaction. Whatever else happened, the Japanese would not be using those supplies to resist the coming American invasion. All along the Philippine coast, similar scenes were unfolding. Destroyers struck port facilities, airfields, supply depots, communication centers. The bombardment was devastating, not because individual destroyers carried overwhelming firepower, but because over 100 destroyers firing simultaneously created a concentration of destruction that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. Japanese shore batteries returned fire, but they had been positioned to defend against conventional naval approaches, not against a dispersed force striking from multiple directions simultaneously. Some destroyers took hits. USS Hazelwood sustained damage to her forward superstructure. USS Hull lost power to one engine. USS Johnston took a direct hit that killed 8 sailors. But the American withdrawal was already underway, destroyers turning east and accelerating to maximum speed, racing away from the coast before Japanese naval forces could arrive. Admiral Toyoda stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, watching the smoke rising from the Philippine coast, and understanding that he had been outmaneuvered. His fleet had sortied from Manila Bay at maximum speed, racing to intercept what intelligence had reported as a major American formation approaching from the east. But by the time his battleships and cruisers reached the area where the American force had been reported, the enemy was already withdrawing. Toyoda, whose radar operators reported multiple contacts heading east at high speed, too fast for his battleships to catch, too dispersed to engage effectively, even if he could close the range. The Americans had struck, inflicted significant damage, and were withdrawing before Japanese forces could respond. It was a perfect execution of what naval theorists called a raid in force, except conducted at a scale and with a precision that Toyoda had not believed possible. "Pursue," Toyoda ordered, though he knew it was futile. His battleships could make perhaps 26 knots in calm seas. The American destroyers were making 27 to 30 knots and had a head start. The chase would accomplish nothing except to expose his fleet to American submarine and air attack. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the battleship division, voiced what everyone on Yamato's bridge was thinking. "Admiral, they deceived us. They scattered their forces across thousands of miles of ocean, made us believe we were seeing routine patrol operations, then concentrated with precision we cannot match. They struck and withdrew before we could respond. This is not simply a tactical defeat. This is evidence that American operational capabilities have evolved beyond our ability to counter." Toyoda said nothing. There was nothing to say. Kurita was correct. The Americans had demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that Japanese forces could not match. They had transformed dispersal from a vulnerability into a tactical advantage. They had executed an operation that required navigation precision, communication discipline, and coordination that Japanese doctrine considered possible for large forces. "Recall the fleet," Toyoda said quietly. "Return to anchorage. We cannot catch them, and pursuing will only expose us to submarine attack." The withdrawal of the Japanese fleet marked the end of Operation Silent Convergence, though that name would not be applied until months later when the operation was analyzed by historians and theorists. For the destroyer crews that executed it, the operation was simply a mission accomplished, another chapter in the long campaign across the Pacific. USS Kidd arrived at Ulithi Atoll on November 13th, her crew exhausted but exhilarated. Commander Lawrence brought his ship alongside the fuel pier, watching as his crew secured the lines with practiced efficiency. They had been at sea for 15 days, navigated over 6,000 miles, maintained radio silence for 8 days, executed a precision strike, and withdrawn without serious damage. It was, Lawrence reflected, probably the most complex operation he had ever been part of, and it had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Admiral Mitcher's flagship arrived at Ulithi the following day. Mitcher immediately received orders to report to Pearl Harbor for a conference with Admiral Nimitz. The summons was not unexpected. Mitcher had executed a major operation without explicit authorization, violated conventional doctrine, and risked over 100 destroyers on an operational experiment. The fact that the operation had succeeded did not change the fact that he had exceeded his authority. The flight from Ulithi to Pearl Harbor took 14 hours, giving Mitcher time to prepare his defense. But when he arrived at Pacific Fleet headquarters on November 17th and was ushered into Nimitz's office, he found not an angry commander preparing to relieve him, but a thoughtful strategist trying to understand what had been accomplished and what it meant. "Mark, sit down," Nimitz said, gesturing to a chair. "We need to talk about what you did, why you did it, and what happens next." Mitcher sat, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Sir, I take full responsibility for executing an operation without explicit authorization. If you need to relieve me, I understand." "I'm not going to relieve you," Nimitz said. "Though I should. What you did was operationally brilliant and procedurally insubordinate. You demonstrated that dispersed operations can achieve surprise and flexibility that concentrated forces cannot. You also demonstrated that one admiral's operational innovation can create strategic complications for everyone else. So before we discuss what you did, I need to understand why you did it." Mitcher leaned back in his chair, organizing his thoughts. "Sir, I've been watching how the Japanese respond to our operations for 2 years. They're predictable. When they detect a large American formation, they assume it represents a major offensive, and they respond with everything they have. That predictability is a vulnerability we can exploit." He stood and walked to the chart table. "But to exploit it, we need to operate in ways they don't expect. Concentrated formations are easy to detect and track. The Japanese see us coming from hundreds of miles away. They have time to position forces, prepare defenses, coordinate responses. We win those engagements because we have superior firepower and better technology, but we pay a price in ships and men. Mitchell pointed to the chart showing the Western Pacific. Dispersed operations change the equation. Scattered forces are difficult to detect and track. Individual destroyers look like routine patrols, not elements of a major offensive. By the time the enemy recognizes what's happening, we're already in strike positions. We achieve surprise, strike with concentrated firepower, and withdraw before they can respond effectively. We win without paying the price that conventional operations demand. And the coordination challenges? Nimitz asked, how did you solve the problem of coordinating over 100 ships without radio communication? Pre-planned navigation, Mitchell replied. Each destroyer captain received detailed orders specifying exact courses, speeds, and timing. They navigated using celestial fixes and dead reckoning. We trained for 6 weeks before executing the operation, practicing the navigation techniques, building confidence that it could be done. The key was trusting that every captain would execute his orders precisely. And they did. Nimitz walked to the window overlooking Pearl Harbor. Mark, what you've done is demonstrate that naval warfare is evolving in ways that challenge everything we've been teaching for generations. Concentration of force has been a fundamental principle since Trafalgar. You've shown that dispersal, properly executed, can be equally effective and sometimes superior. That has implications far beyond this one operation. He turned to face Mitchell. I'm not going to relieve you, but I am going to require that future operations of this type be coordinated through fleet headquarters. What you did worked, but it worked partly because you got lucky with weather, with Japanese responses, with a dozen other variables that might have gone differently. We need to institutionalize these techniques, develop doctrine, train more broadly. We need to transform your operational innovation into standard capability. Yes, sir. I understand. And Mark, one more thing. You changed warfare. Whether you intended to or not, whether you fully understand the implications or not, you demonstrated that the nature of naval operations is evolving. The Navy is going to be studying what you did for decades. You've earned your place in history. Try not to let it go to your head. Mitchell smiled slightly, the first expression of emotion he had shown since entering the office. I'll do my best, sir. The analysis of Operation Silent Convergence began immediately at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Captain Theodore Roscoe, a naval theorist who had been studying the evolution of destroyer tactics, was assigned to lead a comprehensive study of the operation. He spent 3 months interviewing participants, reviewing navigation logs, analyzing Japanese intelligence reports, and attempting to understand exactly how the operation had succeeded and what lessons could be drawn from it. Roscoe's report, completed in February 1945, ran to over 200 pages of detailed analysis. But the executive summary captured the essential findings in a few paragraphs. Operation Silent Convergence represents a fundamental evolution in naval warfare, Roscoe wrote. The operation demonstrated that dispersed forces, properly coordinated through pre-planned navigation and strict communication discipline, can achieve surprise and operational flexibility that concentrated forces cannot match. The coordination challenges are significant, requiring superior navigation skills, meticulous planning, and precise execution. But when these challenges are overcome, dispersed operations offer advantages that may outweigh the traditional benefits of concentration. The report identified several factors that had contributed to the operation's success. Superior navigation training had enabled destroyer captains to achieve unprecedented precision over extended distances. Meticulous planning had accounted for weather, currents, and the myriad variables affecting ship movements. Strict operational security had prevented intelligence leaks. And perhaps most importantly, The operation had exploited Japanese assumptions about how American forces would operate using enemy doctrine against itself. But the report also identified risks and limitations. The operation had succeeded partly because weather conditions had been generally favorable. Severe storms could have scattered the destroyer groups beyond their ability to reconverge. The operation had required 8 days of radio silence, during which commanders had no ability to adjust plans based on changing circumstances. If Japanese forces had sortied more aggressively during the dispersal phase, isolated destroyer groups might have been overwhelmed before they could concentrate for mutual support. The report concluded with recommendations for future operations. Dispersed approaches should be considered for situations where surprise was critical and where the target justified the risks. But such operations required extensive training, careful planning, and favorable conditions. They were not appropriate for routine application, but represented a valuable capability for specific circumstances. The recommendations were incremented gradually over the following months. Destroyer squadrons received enhanced navigation training. Planning staffs developed doctrine for dispersed operations. Communication protocols were refined to allow brief, encrypted updates without compromising operational security. By mid-1945, the U.S. Navy possessed a genuine capability for dispersed operations, transforming Mitcher's operational innovation into institutional competence. The Japanese analysis of Operation Silent Convergence, conducted after the war, reached conclusions that were both similar and different from the American assessment. Japanese naval officers recognized that they had been outmaneuvered at the operational level, but they struggled to understand how American forces had achieved such precise coordination without radio communication. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, wrote extensively about the operation in his post-war memoirs. The Americans demonstrated capabilities we had not imagined possible. Hara reflected, "We assumed large forces required constant radio communication for coordination. We assumed dispersed forces were vulnerable and ineffective. We assumed navigation over extended distances would produce significant errors. The Americans disproved every assumption. They operated in ways our doctrine said were impossible, and they succeeded brilliantly." Hara's analysis identified the operation as a turning point in the Pacific War, not because of its immediate tactical results, though those were significant, but because of its psychological impact on Japanese commanders. After November 1944, we could never be certain what we were seeing represented reality. Hara wrote, "Every contact might be routine patrol activity or might be an element of a coordinated offensive. That uncertainty paralyzed our decision-making. We became reactive, responding to American initiatives rather than executing our own plans. The strategic impact of Operation Silent Convergence extended beyond its immediate tactical results. The operation had demonstrated that American naval forces possessed operational capabilities that Japanese forces could not match. This realization influenced Japanese strategic planning throughout the final months of the war, contributing to the increasingly defensive posture that characterized Japanese operations in 1945. More broadly, the operation contributed to the growing recognition within Japanese leadership that the war was unwinnable. If American forces could strike anywhere with little warning, if they could operate in ways that Japanese doctrine considered impossible, if they'd achieve surprise despite Japanese radar and reconnaissance, then Japan's strategy of inflicting casualties sufficient to force a negotiated peace had become untenable. The human stories behind Operation Silent Convergence emerged gradually over the decades following the war. Commander Lawrence, who had commanded USS Kidd during the operation, continued in the Navy until 1962, retiring as a rear admiral. In a 1978 interview, he reflected on what the operation had meant to him personally. "We proved that American sailors could do things that everyone said were impossible." Lawrence said, "Navigate independently for 8 days across thousands of miles of ocean and arrive within miles of where we were supposed to be. The experts said it couldn't be done reliably. We did it. Coordinate over 100 ships without radio communication. The tacticians said it was operationally unsound. We did it. The operation succeeded because stopped listening to people who told us what couldn't be done and started figuring out how to do it anyway. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, who had served as navigator aboard USS Heermann during the operation, left the Navy after the war and became a professor of navigation at the Merchant Marine Academy. He taught celestial navigation to generations of merchant officers, always emphasizing the importance of precision and the need to trust mathematical calculations, even when intuition suggested otherwise. Operation Silent Convergence taught me that navigation is not just a technical skill. Hayes told his students, it's a form of operational art. The ability to position your vessel exactly where it needs to be there, that's what enables everything else. Without precise navigation, that entire operation would have failed. Every other aspect, the tactics, the firepower, the courage, all of it depended on navigators doing their jobs with absolute precision. Admiral Mitcher, promoted to full admiral after the war, rarely spoke publicly about Operation Silent Convergence. But in private conversations with fellow officers, he emphasized the operation's broader implications for naval warfare. Why demonstrated that imagination and innovation can be as valuable as firepower. Mitcher told Admiral Spruance in 1946, the Japanese expect us to operate in certain ways, according to certain patterns. When we operated differently, when we challenged their assumptions, we gained advantages that no amount of superior technology could provide. That lesson remains relevant. The enemy's expectations are a vulnerability we can exploit, but only if we're willing to challenge our own assumptions about what's possible. The legacy of Operation Silent Convergence, measured not in ships sunk or territory captured, but in its influence on how naval forces thought about warfare, proved more enduring than the operation's immediate tactical results. The destroyers that had executed the operation eventually were scrapped or sunk as targets. The men who had commanded them passed away, but the principles they had demonstrated became foundational elements of modern naval warfare. The Cold War saw extensive application of these principles. American and Soviet naval forces both developed capabilities for dispersed operations, recognizing that concentration made fleets vulnerable to nuclear weapons. The ability to scatter forces across vast ocean areas, then concentrate rapidly for strikes, became fundamental to naval doctrine. Submarines refined techniques for coordinated attacks without radio communication. Surface action groups practiced dispersal and concentration maneuvers that traced their lineage directly to Operation Silent Convergence. The modern relevance of Operation Silent Convergence remains a subject of debate among contemporary military strategists. Some argue that satellite navigation and secure digital communications have eliminated the challenges that made the operation so difficult. Others contend that the operation's fundamental principles, dispersal as a tactical advantage, operational security through emissions control, precision coordination through superior planning, remain as relevant today as they were in 1944. The United States Navy's Distributed Maritime Operations concept, developed in the 2010s, draws explicitly on lessons from Operation Silent Convergence. The concept envisions naval forces operating dispersed across vast areas, maintaining operational security through emissions control, then concentrating rapidly for strikes using pre-planned coordination and secure communications. The technology has evolved dramatically since 1944, but the operational principles remain recognizable descendants of what Admiral Mitcher and his destroyer captains accomplished in the Western Pacific. On November 9, 2024, 80 years after Operation Silent Convergence, the U.S. Navy held a commemoration ceremony at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Descendants of the destroyer crews who had executed the operation gathered to honor the achievement and remember the men who had made it possible. No veterans survived, but their legacy lived on in the doctrine, training, and operational concepts that continued to shape naval warfare. Admiral Lisa Franchetti, Chief of Naval Operations, spoke at the ceremony about what Operation Silent Convergence meant for contemporary naval operations. 80 years ago, American destroyer crews executed an operation that challenged every assumption about how naval forces should operate. Franchetti said, "They dispersed when doctrine said they should concentrate. They maintained radio silence when experts said communication was essential. They navigated with precision that professionals said was impossible. And they succeeded brilliantly, demonstrating that the greatest limitations are often the ones we impose on ourselves through assumptions about what's possible." She continued, "Today we face different challenges in a different strategic environment. But the fundamental lesson of Operation Silent Convergence remains relevant. Success in naval warfare requires more than superior technology or overwhelming numbers. It requires the willingness to challenge conventional thinking, the courage to attempt operations that others consider impossible, and the skill to execute with precision under the most demanding circumstances. That's the legacy those destroyer crews left us. That's what we honor today." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for all who had served in the Pacific War. As the attendees dispersed, descendants of Operation Silent Convergence participants reflected on what their fathers and grandfathers had accomplished 8 decades earlier. Michael Chen, whose grandfather had been the intelligence officer who first recognized the pattern of dispersed destroyer movements, spoke about discovering his grandfather's role only after his death. "He never talked about the war," Chen said. "After he died, we found his papers, including his original analysis, that identified what Mitchell was doing. Reading those documents, understanding how he pieced together scattered intelligence reports to recognize a pattern no one else had seen. It was remarkable. He helped make that operation possible, and he never mentioned it. That generation's humility, their sense that they were just doing their duty, it's something we should remember." The technical documentation of Operation Silent Convergence, declassified gradually over the decades following the war, filled archives at the Naval War College, the National Archives, and various research institutions. Navigation logs, after-action reports, intelligence assessments, personal diaries, and official correspondence provided detailed records of how the operation had been planned and executed. Dr. James Hornfisher, a naval historian who wrote extensively about the Pacific War, spent years researching Operation Silent Convergence for a book published in 2019. His research revealed details about the operation that had not been widely known, including the extent of the navigation challenges, the psychological strain of maintaining radio silence for extended periods, and the narrow margins by which the operation had succeeded. "What struck me most," Hornfisher wrote in his book's introduction, "was how close the operation came to failure at several points. Weather nearly scattered some destroyer groups beyond their ability to reconverge. Navigation errors accumulated that might have prevented some ships from reaching their assigned positions. Japanese reconnaissance came close to discovering the convergence before it was complete. The operation succeeded not because it was easy, but because the men executing it refused to fail. They navigated through challenges, corrected errors, maintained discipline under tremendous pressure, and accomplished something unprecedented. The story of Operation Silent Convergence is ultimately a story about human capability, about what becomes possible when training, planning, courage, and skill combine in pursuit of a common objective. It is a story about innovation in the face of conventional wisdom that said certain things could not be done. It is a story about the evolution of warfare, about how operational art can achieve strategic effects that firepower alone cannot produce. The silent convergence of over 100 destroyers across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, navigating independently for 8 days, striking with devastating precision, and withdrawing before the enemy could respond. That was what American naval forces accomplished in November 1944. And that achievement, that demonstration of what becomes possible when innovation meets execution, when planning meets courage, when training meets determination, that remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago. The operation was real. Its legacy endures. The fog rolled in from the North Atlantic as Captain Robert Sinclair stood on the bridge of HMS Daring, watching the gray waters merge with the gray sky until there was no horizon, only an endless expanse of cold emptiness. It was March 14, 1943, and Sinclair had been at sea for 11 days, navigating through some of the most dangerous waters in the world without seeing another friendly vessel. Without receiving any radio communication, without any confirmation that the operation he was participating in was proceeding according to plan. Sinclair was 42 years old, a career Royal Navy officer who had commanded destroyers since 1939. He had fought in the Norwegian campaign, escorted convoys through the Mediterranean, participated in the hunt for the Bismarck. He understood naval warfare, understood the importance of concentration of force, mutual support, coordinated action. Which made this operation all the more unsettling, because it violated every principle he had been taught. 11 days earlier, HMS Daring had departed Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, along with 3 other destroyers from her flotilla. They had received sealed orders to be opened only after clearing Scottish waters. When Sinclair had opened those orders at midnight on March 4th, he had read them 3 times, certain there must be some mistake. The orders directed HMS Daring to proceed independently to a position in the mid-Atlantic, approximately 800 miles west of Ireland, maintaining absolute radio silence throughout the transit. Upon reaching the designated position on March 15th, Daring was to commence anti-submarine patrol operations in coordination with other vessels that would arrive simultaneously from different departure points. The orders specified exact courses, speeds, and timing, but provided no information about how many other vessels would be participating or what the overall operational objective might be. What made the orders extraordinary was the navigation requirement. Sinclair was directed to arrive at a specific position, accurate to within 5 nautical miles, at a specific time, accurate to within 30 minutes. After 11 days of independent navigation through the North Atlantic in March, when weather conditions were notoriously unpredictable and celestial navigation was often impossible due to cloud cover. The orders concluded with a statement that was both reassuring and ominous. This operation represents a new approach to anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Success depends on precise navigation and strict radio silence. The lives of thousands of merchant seamen depend on your execution of these orders. Sinclair had called his navigator, Lieutenant Commanders Morrison, to the bridge and shown him the orders. Morrison had studied them in silence for several minutes before speaking. "Sir, this is asking us to achieve navigation precision that's theoretically possible but practically very difficult. 11 days in the North Atlantic in March. We'll be lucky to get 3 or 4 good celestial fixes. The rest will be dead reckoning, estimating our position based on course and speed. Currents in the North Atlantic are variable and poorly charted. Wind and weather will affect our speed. The errors compound over time. Can we do it?" Sinclair had asked. Morrison had hesitated before answering. "If we're very careful, if we take every possible celestial fix, if we constantly monitor our speed and adjust for estimated current, if we're lucky with weather, then yes, we can probably get within 10 to 15 miles of the designated position. Whether that's close enough depends on what this operation is trying to accomplish. The orders say 5 miles. Then we'll need to be better than very careful. We'll need to be perfect." For 11 days, Morrison had been striving for perfection. He took celestial fixes whenever the sky cleared enough to see stars or sun, sometimes standing on the bridge wing in freezing rain for hours waiting for a brief break in the clouds. Between fixes, he constantly recalculated their position based on course, speed, and estimated current. He maintained a navigation plot that was updated every hour, showing their estimated position, the uncertainty in that estimate, and the corrections needed to reach their objective. Sinclair had watched his navigator's dedication with a mixture of admiration and concern. Morrison was driving himself to exhaustion, sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a day, spending the rest of his time on the bridge or in the chart room. But the precision required by the orders demanded nothing less. Now, on the morning of March 14th, with 24 hours remaining before they were supposed to reach their designated position, Morrison presented his latest navigation plot to Sinclair. "Sir, based on our last celestial fix at dawn, which was reasonably good, I estimate we're here." Morrison pointed to a position on the chart. "We're approximately 120 miles from our objective. If we maintain our current course and speed, we should arrive at the designated position at 1,000 hours tomorrow, plus or minus 30 minutes. The uncertainty in our position is approximately 8 miles, which means we could be anywhere within a 16-mile diameter circle." "The orders specify 5 miles, Sinclair said. "Yes, sir. I'm aware. I'll take another fix at dusk if the weather permits, and that should reduce our uncertainty. But we're operating at the limits of what celestial navigation can achieve under these conditions." Sinclair studied the chart. "What's your confidence level that we'll be within the required tolerance?" Morrison considered the question carefully. 60%, sir. Maybe 70 if we get good fixes today and tomorrow morning. But I can't give you better than that. There are too many variables, too many sources of error. Then we'll have to hope that 60 or 70% is good enough. Because we're not breaking radio silence to ask for clarification, and we're not deviating from the orders. What Sinclair could not know, what no individual captain participating in this operation could know, was that HMS Daring was one of 73 destroyers, corvettes, and frigates converging on positions throughout the North Atlantic from departure points scattered across Britain, Iceland, Newfoundland, and the eastern United States. Each vessel was navigating independently, maintaining radio silence, attempting to achieve the same impossible standard of precision that Morrison was striving for aboard HMS Daring. The operation, code, named Invisible Armada, though that name would not be applied until months later, represented the most ambitious attempt yet to solve the problem that was slowly strangling Britain's ability to continue the war. German U-boats, operating in wolf packs coordinated by radio communication, were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The convoy system provided some protection, concentrating merchant vessels under escort, but convoys were predictable. U-boats could position themselves along known convoy routes, wait for targets to appear, then attack in coordinated groups that overwhelmed the escorts. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, had been wrestling with this problem since taking command in November 1942. Horton was 59 years old, a former submarine commander who understood undersea warfare from the perspective of both hunter and hunted. He recognized that the fundamental problem with convoy escort was that it was reactive. Escorts protected convoys, but they could not hunt U-boats proactively without leaving the convoys vulnerable. What Horton needed was a way to hunt U-boats aggressively while still protecting convoys. But aggressive hunting required concentrating anti-submarine vessels in areas where U-boats were operating, and concentrating forces meant stripping escorts from convoys. The dilemma seemed insoluble. The solution, when it came to Horton in January 1943, was radical enough that he spent 3 weeks evaluating it before presenting it to the Admiralty. Instead of concentrating anti-submarine forces visibly, creating formations that German reconnaissance could detect and U-boats could avoid, what if the Royal Navy dispersed its forces across the Atlantic, had them navigate independently to predetermined positions, then concentrated them suddenly in areas where U-boats were known to be operating? The concept depended on several assumptions. First, that British intelligence could identify areas where U-boats were concentrating with sufficient accuracy to make the operation worthwhile. Second, that Royal Navy vessels could navigate with sufficient precision to arrive at designated positions, despite the challenges of North Atlantic weather. Third, that the sudden appearance of concentrated anti-submarine forces would catch U-boats by surprise, allowing aggressive hunting before the Germans could disperse. Horton had presented the concept to the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, on February 2, 1943. Pound had listened to the proposal with the skepticism of a man who had been fighting this war for 3.5 years and had learned to distrust innovative solutions that seemed too clever. Max, you're proposing to scatter 70 or 80 anti-submarine vessels across the Atlantic, have them navigate independently for up to 2 weeks, then concentrate them in areas where you think U-boats might be operating. Pound had said, "The navigation challenge alone is extraordinary. The North Atlantic in winter is not the Pacific in summer. Weather is terrible, celestial navigation is often impossible, currents are variable. Your vessels will be scattered across hundreds of miles when they're supposed to be concentrated." "I'm aware of the challenges, sir," Horton had replied. "But consider the alternative. We're losing this battle. U-boats are sinking our merchant ships faster than we can replace them. The convoy system provides some protection, but it's not enough. We need to hunt U-boats aggressively, and we can't do that with our current approach. And you believe this dispersed approach will allow aggressive hunting?" "I believe it will achieve surprise. German reconnaissance tracks our convoy escorts, monitors our patrol patterns. They know where our anti-submarine forces are concentrated. But if we disperse our forces, navigate independently, then concentrate suddenly in areas where U-boats are operating, we achieve surprise. We catch them before they can disperse. We hunt them aggressively for 48 to 72 hours, then disperse again before German reconnaissance can coordinate a response." Pound had studied the proposal in silence for several minutes. "The Admiralty will never approve this. It's too risky, too dependent on precise navigation, too many things that can go wrong. Then we lose the Battle of the Atlantic," Horton had said quietly. "Because what we're doing now isn't working." Pound had looked up from the proposal, his face showing the strain of 3.5 years of war. "I'll present it to the War Cabinet. But Max, if this fails, if we lose vessels because of navigation errors, or because U-boats catch our ships scattered and unable to support each other, it's on both of us. The Admiralty will demand heads, and ours will be first." "I understand, sir." The War Cabinet had debated the proposal for 2 weeks before Prime Minister Winston Churchill made the final decision. Churchill understood naval warfare, having served as First Lord of the Admiralty in both World Wars. He recognized the risks Horton was proposing, but he also recognized that Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and that losing that battle meant losing the war. "Gentlemen, we are being strangled," Churchill had told the War Cabinet on February 18, 1943. "German U-boats are sinking our merchant ships, cutting our supply lines, threatening our ability to continue this war. Admiral Horton proposes an operation that challenges conventional doctrine, but offers the possibility of achieving surprise against an enemy that has become too comfortable, too confident. I say we attempt it. If it fails, we are no worse off than we are now. If it succeeds, we may turn the tide in the Atlantic." The authorization had been granted on February 20th, and planning had begun immediately. Horton's staff had worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks, calculating navigation routes, identifying departure points, coordinating timing, preparing detailed orders for each participating vessel. The operation would commence on March 3rd, with vessels departing from various ports over a 48-hour period. Convergence would occur on March 15th in 3 separate areas of the North Atlantic where intelligence indicated U-boat concentrations. Now, on March 14th, 1943, 73 Royal Navy vessels were approaching their designated positions, each one navigating independently, each captain trusting that dozens of other captains were doing the same thing, all of them moving toward a convergence that would either vindicate Horton's vision or prove that some operational innovations were too ambitious to succeed. Aboard HMS Daring, Lieutenant Commander Morrison took his final celestial fix at dusk on March 14th. The weather had cooperated, providing clear skies for nearly 30 minutes, long enough to take multiple star sights and calculate a reliable position. Morrison worked the calculations 3 times, checking and rechecking his mathematics, before presenting the results to Captain Sinclair. "Sir, our position is here." Morrison pointed to a mark on the chart. "We're 85 miles from our objective. The uncertainty in this fix is approximately 3 miles, which is as good as we're going to get. If we maintain course and speed through the night, we should arrive at the designated position at 0945 hours tomorrow, plus or minus 15 minutes. Sinclair studied the chart. "Within the required tolerance." "Yes, sir. Assuming this fix is accurate and assuming we don't encounter unexpected currents overnight, we should be within 5 miles of the designated position at the designated time." "Outstanding work, James. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be interesting." Morrison left the bridge, and Sinclair stood alone in the darkness, watching the stars that had made the navigation possible. In 12 hours, he would discover whether this operation was brilliant or foolish, whether Admiral Horton's vision would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare or prove to be an expensive failure. The night passed slowly. Sinclair remained on the bridge, unwilling to sleep when so much depended on the next few hours. At 0600 hours, Morrison returned to the bridge and took a dawn celestial fix. The results confirmed their position. They were on course, on schedule, approaching the designated position with acceptable precision. At 0800 hours, the fog that had been intermittent for days suddenly lifted, and Sinclair saw something that made his breath catch. On the horizon, barely visible in the morning light, were the silhouettes of other vessels. Destroyers, corvettes, frigates, all converging on the same area from different directions. The scattered fleet was concentrating. "My God," Morrison said quietly, standing beside Sinclair on the bridge wing. "It worked. They're all here." By 1000 hours, 32 Royal Navy vessels had concentrated in a 20-mile radius around the designated position. The convergence was not perfect. Some ships arrived early, others late. Some were 10 or 15 miles from their assigned positions. But the overall achievement was remarkable. 32 vessels, departing from different ports, navigating independently for up to 2 weeks through the North Atlantic in March, had arrived at approximately the same place at approximately the same time. Admiral Horton, monitoring the operation from his headquarters at Liverpool, received position reports from submarines positioned to observe the convergence. The reports confirmed what he had hoped. The dispersed approach had worked. Royal Navy vessels had concentrated in an area where intelligence indicated significant U-boat activity, and they had done so without German reconnaissance detecting the movement. At 10:30 hours, radio silence ended and Horton transmitted the execute order. The concentrated anti-submarine force, designated Task Force Alpha, was to commence aggressive hunting operations immediately. The vessels formed into small groups, each group assigned a search sector, and began systematic anti-submarine patrols using sonar, radar, and visual observation. The first contact came at 11:47 hours when HMS Hesperus detected a submerged U-boat at a range of 1,800 yards. The corvette attacked immediately with depth charges, forcing the U-boat to surface. HMS Vanessa, operating nearby, engaged the surface submarine with gunfire, scoring multiple hits before the U-boat's crew abandoned ship. U-432 sank at 12:03 hours with the loss of all but 12 crew members. The second contact came 30 minutes later when HMS Vedette detected another submerged contact. This U-boat, U-665, attempted to evade by diving deep and running silent, but the concentrated anti-submarine forces allowed multiple vessels to maintain contact. HMS Vedette, HMS Lucistrife, and HMS Anemone can a coordinated attack, dropping over 60 depth charges in a carefully orchestrated pattern. U-665 surfaced at 13:19 hours, severely damaged, and sank 10 minutes later. throughout March 15th and 16th, Task Force Alpha hunted U-boats with a ferocity and coordination that German submarine commanders had not experienced before. The sudden appearance of concentrated anti-submarine forces in an area where U-boats had been operating with relative freedom created confusion and panic among German commanders. U-boats attempting to attack convoys found themselves being hunted by multiple escorts working in coordination. U-boats attempting to evade were tracked by vessels that appeared from unexpected directions. By the evening of March 16th, Task Force Alpha had sunk 7 U-boats and damaged 4 others severely enough that they were forced to abort their patrols and return to base. The losses represented nearly 10%. The U-boats operating in the North Atlantic at that time, an unsustainable attrition rate that would force German Naval Command to reconsider their entire Atlantic strategy. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat force, received reports of the losses with growing alarm. Dönitz had built his reputation on the Wolfpack tactics that had been so effective against Allied convoys. But those tactics depended on U-boats being able to concentrate against convoys faster than escorts could respond. What had happened on March 15th and 16th suggested that the British had developed a capability to concentrate anti-submarine forces with speed and precision that German intelligence had not anticipated. How did they do this? Dönitz demanded of his intelligence staff on March 17th. How did the British concentrate 30 or more anti-submarine vessels in the mid-Atlantic without our reconnaissance detecting the movement? Where did these ships come from? The intelligence officers had no good answer. German reconnaissance aircraft had been monitoring British ports and convoy routes continuously. They had detected no unusual movements, no large formations departing British waters, nothing that suggested a major anti-submarine operation was being prepared. Yet somehow, the British had concentrated a significant force in the mid-Atlantic and had used that force to devastating effect. They must have dispersed their forces. One intelligence officer suggested, individual ships or small groups departing from different ports, navigating independently, then concentrating at a predetermined location. It's the only explanation that fits the evidence. Dönitz considered this possibility. Dispersed approach operations require precise navigation and coordination. The North Atlantic in March is not conducive to precise navigation. The British would need to achieve navigation accuracy that I would not have thought possible under those conditions. Nevertheless, sir, it appears they achieved it. The concentration was real. The losses we suffered were real. We must assume the British have developed a capability we did not anticipate. Dönitz walked to the map showing U-boat positions across the Atlantic. If the British can concentrate anti-submarine forces anywhere in the Atlantic with little warning, then our Wolfpack tactics become much more risky. U-boats concentrating to attack convoys may find themselves being hunted by concentrated escorts. We need to reconsider our entire approach. The strategic implications of Operation Invisible Armada extended far beyond the 7 U-boats sunk in March 1943. The operation demonstrated that the Royal Navy could concentrate forces in the Atlantic with speed and precision that German intelligence could not track or predict. This capability fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Battle of the Atlantic. Prior to March 1943, U-boats had enjoyed a significant tactical advantage. They could concentrate against convoys faster than escorts could respond, overwhelming defenses through coordinated attacks. But if escorts could concentrate just as quickly, appearing suddenly in areas where U-boats were operating, then the tactical advantage shifted to the defenders. Admiral Horton, analyzing the results of Operation Invisible Armada, recognized that he had demonstrated a capability that could be repeated. The navigation challenges had been overcome. The coordination had worked. The surprise had been achieved. Over the following months, the Royal Navy conducted similar operations, dispersing anti-submarine forces, concentrating them suddenly in areas where U-boats were operating, hunting aggressively for 48 to 72 hours, then dispersing again before German reconnaissance could coordinate a response. The cumulative effect was devastating for the German U-boat force. Losses increased dramatically. Successful attacks against convoys decreased. U-boat commanders became increasingly cautious, unwilling to concentrate for fear of encountering concentrated escorts. By May 1943, just 2 months after Operation Invisible Armada, Arleigh was forced to withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic temporarily, acknowledging that losses had become unsustainable. The withdrawal marked the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Germany would continue to operate U-boats for the remainder of the war, but they would never again pose the existential threat to British supply lines that they had represented in early 1943. The combination of improved technology, better intelligence, and innovative tactics like those demonstrated in Operation Invisible Armada had shifted the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. Captain Sinclair, who had commanded HMS Daring during Operation Invisible Armada, continued to participate in similar operations throughout 1943 and 1944. In a letter to his wife written in June 1943, he reflected on what the operation had meant. "We did something in March that everyone said was impossible," Sinclair wrote. "We navigated across the North Atlantic in the worst weather imaginable and arrived exactly where we were supposed to be. Exactly where we were supposed to be there. And we weren't alone." Dozens of other ships did the same thing. Together, we proved that the Royal Navy could operate in ways the Germans didn't expect, couldn't predict, couldn't counter. That's what wins wars, not superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but the ability to do what the enemy thinks is impossible. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Sinclair's navigator, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his navigation during Operation Invisible Armada. In his citation, Admiral Horton wrote, "Lieutenant Commander Morrison achieved navigation precision under the most challenging conditions that represents the highest standard of professional excellence. His skill enabled HMS Daring to arrive at her designated position within the required tolerance, contributing directly to the success of an operation that changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic." Morrison continued to serve as a navigation specialist throughout the war, training other navigators in the techniques that had made Operation Invisible Armada possible. After the war, he wrote a technical manual on precision navigation in challenging conditions that became standard reading at the Royal Naval College. Admiral Horton, promoted to Admiral of the Fleet in 1945, rarely spoke publicly about Operation Invisible Armada. But in private conversations with fellow officers, he emphasized the operation's broader implications for naval warfare. "We proved that dispersal and concentration are not opposites but complementary tactics," Horton told Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham in 1946. "Dispersal provides security and flexibility. Concentration provides striking power. The ability to transition between dispersal and concentration rapidly, that's what gives you operational advantage. The Germans expected us to operate in predictable patterns. When we operated unpredictably, when we appeared where they didn't expect us, we gained advantages that no amount of superior technology could provide." The legacy of Operation Invisible Armada influenced naval warfare throughout the remainder of World War II and into the post-war era. The techniques developed for the operation, precision navigation under challenging conditions, dispersed approach operations, sudden concentration for strikes, became standard capabilities for major navies. The operation demonstrated that operational innovation could achieve strategic effects that technology alone could not produce. The Cold War saw extensive application of these principles. NATO naval forces developed capabilities for dispersed operations across the Atlantic, recognizing that concentration made fleets vulnerable to Soviet submarines and aircraft. The ability to scatter forces across vast ocean areas, then concentrate rapidly for strikes or convoy protection, became fundamental to NATO naval doctrine. Soviet naval theorists, studying Operation Invisible Armada as part of their analysis of Western naval capabilities, incorporated similar concepts into their own doctrine. Soviet submarines practiced coordinated operations without radio communication, using pre-arranged timing and navigation to converge on targets. Soviet surface action groups developed dispersal tactics designed to complicate NATO targeting while maintaining the ability to concentrate for strikes. The modern relevance of Operation Invisible Armada remains evident in contemporary naval operations. The United States Navy's Distributed Maritime Operations concept, the Royal Navy's Littoral Response Group concept, and similar doctrines developed by other major navies all incorporate principles first demonstrated in the North Atlantic in March 1943. The technology has evolved dramatically, but the fundamental insight that dispersal and concentration are complementary rather than contradictory tactics remains valid. On March 15, 2023, 80 years after Operation Invisible Armada, the Royal Navy held a commemoration ceremony at the Western Approaches Museum in Liverpool. Descendants of the crews who had executed the operation gathered to honor the achievement and remember the men who had made it possible. No veterans survived, but their legacy lived on in the doctrine, training, and operational concepts that continued to shape naval warfare. Admiral Sir Burke, First Sea Lord and Chief of Naval Staff, spoke at the ceremony about what Operation Invisible Armada meant for contemporary naval operations. 80 years ago, Royal Navy sailors executed an operation that challenged every assumption about what was possible in naval warfare. He said, "They navigated across the North Atlantic in March, achieving precision that experts said was impossible. They maintained radio silence for up to 2 weeks, trusting that dozens of other ships were doing the same. They concentrated suddenly in areas where German U-boats were operating, achieving surprise that changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. They proved that operational innovation, superior training, and meticulous planning could overcome any challenge." He continued, "Today, we face different threats in a different strategic environment. But the fundamental lesson of Operation Invisible Armada remains relevant. Success in naval warfare requires more than superior technology. It requires the willingness to challenge conventional thinking, the courage to attempt operations that others consider impossible, and the skill to execute with precision under the most demanding circumstances. That's the legacy those sailors left us. That's what we honor today." The ceremony concluded with a wreath, laying at the memorial to those who had died in the Battle of the Atlantic. As the wreath was placed, descendants of Operation Invisible Armada participants reflected on what their fathers and grandfathers had accomplished 8 decades earlier. Elizabeth Morrison, whose grandfather had been the navigator aboard HMS Daring, spoke about discovering his role only after his death. "He never talked about the war," Morrison said. "After he died, we found his navigation logs from March 1943. Reading those logs, seeing the meticulous calculations, understanding the pressure he was under to achieve impossible precision. It was overwhelming. He navigated HMS Daring across the North Atlantic and arrived within 3 miles of where he was supposed to be after 11 days of independent navigation. And he considered that just part of his job. The professionalism of that generation, their dedication to excellence even when no one was watching, it's something we should remember and emulate." The story of Operation Invisible Armada is ultimately a story about human capability under extreme pressure. It is a story about sailors who achieved navigation precision that experts said was impossible, who maintained discipline under conditions of complete uncertainty, who trusted that their fellow sailors were doing the same, and who succeeded in changing the course of history. The Invisible Armada that converged in the North Atlantic in March 1943, 73 vessels that had navigated independently through some of the most challenging waters in the world, concentrated with remarkable precision, hunted U-boats with devastating effectiveness, and demonstrated that operational innovation could achieve strategic results. That armada was real. The men who sailed those ships were real. The U-boats they sank were real. The turning point they created in the Battle of the Atlantic was real. And the legacy they left The demonstration that the greatest limitations are often the ones we impose on ourselves through assumptions about what is possible. That legacy remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago. When those assumptions are challenged, when conventional wisdom is questioned, when sailors are willing to attempt what others say cannot be done, that is when the impossible becomes merely difficult, and the difficult becomes achievable. That is the legacy of Operation Invisible Armada. That is what those sailors proved in the North Atlantic in March 1943. And that achievement continues to inspire and guide naval forces around the world, a reminder that excellence, innovation, and determination can overcome any obstacle, achieve any objective, change the course of history. The Invisible Armada was real. Its legacy is eternal.